this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, so we are continuing our deep dive into the occult with something that's a little bit more off the beaten path. We have plans for the future to go back over some of the big figures, right, who everyone's heard of that ought to be discussed. But this is a slightly less well-traveled road. So do you want to first, I guess, explain what we're talking about and then conceptually why this is something that, it ought to be included in a discussion of the American occult?
Yeah, definitely. I started thinking last episode as we dealt with the black metal scene, which was a very sort of punctuated series of events in what I think of as the final phase of the occult revival. And make no mistake, there was an occult revival, and it peaked in from the 60s to the 80s, in my opinion. Its origins, however, were very much in the early 20th century and the inner warriors. I've made the point before on other subjects, or when we're dealing with other dedicated topics, people make a lot of the fact that Rudolf Hess and his wife were into astrology. Well, in those days, that wasn't really weird. In The Great Gatsby, the reason why Daisy Buchanan and her friends, they go to seances and stuff, that's something rich people did. Rich waspy people in a Prohibition era, they were into spiritualism and stuff like that. Like, corny and weird as that might seem, it wasn't this crazy thing. That doesn't mean that.
Well, and it was shortly followed up by kind of a modern instantiation of that, which is like Freudianism, right? The whole phrase of a Freudian slip is it was sort of a popular parlor game to play these kind of free association word games. And the goal was to sort of trip up the other people at the party into, admitting something shocking or sexual. Like it simply was a feature of culture at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the personages we're going to get into in discursive terms, they were very much reacting with extreme prejudice against Freudianism. So yeah, these things were dominant strains in the culture. But also, there is a link between revolutionary fascism and its subsequent ideological manifestations and occult tendencies. That's not even suggesting something sinister or conspiratorial. It's just a fact. And we got into it in some of the earlier episodes how some of these processed church people and adjacent, subcultural elements, they gravitated towards and they curated relationships or tried to with radical National Socialist types, in part because this figured into their eschatology, and they viewed a lot of these radical racialist guys and a lot of these radical neo-fascist guys as a catalyzing agent in reining in apocalyptic phenomena. Okay, but the origins of American National Socialism as a subculture, it's not George Lincoln Rockwell, who I don't think positively of at all. I think he was a carny. I think he was a con man. He very much was putting on a vaudeville performance that was curated to shock squares and the John Birch Society, but he had no understanding of National Socialism. He was a joker. He was a prankster. And maybe there's a place for that. But the way he went about it was not a credit to the heritage that he claimed to be representing. And most of the things, the direct action type stuff and the organizational model that he maintained he largely borrowed that from other people, and including a guy named James Hartung Maddow, who, in my opinion, really is the father of the American old resistance. And his proverbial DNA, his ideological DNA, is very much in the dissident element of the new resistance. And no small measure because Maddow broke entirely with conservatism and said these people are our enemies. We don't want anything to do with them. He backed the Soviet Union in the Cold War after 1953 for reasons we'll get into. And he wasn't just a joker. He had I'll pull up some data points to explicate better who he was. James Hartung Maddow, he lived his whole life in New York City. Okay, he was born in 1927. He crossed paths with Francis Yockey in a critical way that really kind of put him on the map with the National Socialist resistance in exile, which at that time was based in Argentina, and then it largely migrated to the Middle East, owing to the ramping up of tensions between Arab liberationist governments and the Zionist state, as well as the fact that Perón was out of office. And make no mistake, Perón was a National Socialist, and so was his wife. Okay. Maddow's patron was a man named Fred Weiss. Okay. Fred Weiss was a German expat. He'd was something of a self-styled intellectual and writer. He was independently wealthy, at least in his younger years. He ended his life in fairly impoverished circumstances, but he lived in the United States for a time. He returned to the Kaiserreich when Germany went to war in 1914, and he served as an artillery officer with the Field Artillery Regiment 29. He was at Ypres, he was at the Somme. He was in very heavy action. And then subsequently, he fought against he fought with white elements in the Baltic against the communists, just as guys like Alfred Rosenberg did and Max von Schuttner-Richter did. He ended up getting locked up by the French authorities when they seized the Ruhr in 1920. They tried to bring up on charges as a war criminal. I guess he'd ordered the shelling of some French town. So he spent about a year incarcerated, but by 1930 he was back in the United States. He made a bunch more money in real estate. He settled around White Plains, and he married a woman who was a mystic, quite literally. Her name was Marie Urbas. She was a hairdresser. She had a hairstyling business, but she was into mysticism. She was an Odinist. Weiss insisted that he told H.G. Thompson and Yockey both that his wife had a mystical vision of Odin, who that she was some sort of conduit for the old gods, either by way of epigenetic or blood memory, as they would have called it in those days, or based on some sort of spiritual aptitude she curated. But Weiss and H. Keith Thompson, they were almost certainly working for German intelligence in the United States, and how Weiss and Thompson managed to not get swept up in some of these anti-espionage trials and some of these sedition trials is an open-ended question that's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about. Weiss, I believe, in the sedition trial, the 1944 sedition trial, he was for a time attached as a defendant, and I believe he was released as a defendant or discharged from the indictment, and but was under subpoena as a material witness. Something very weird. But point is, he wasn't. All those defendants were acquitted, but he didn't have to see his way to formal acquittal to get out of jeopardy. I believe they dismissed him from the indictment for whatever reason. But when World War II ended, Vice, like most National Socialists, the things seemed kind of rudderless. And this was before the McCarthy era and things, and before the Cold War had set in earnest. So they were very much, they were still very much being harassed, harangued, hunted down, in some cases indicted, in some cases murdered. So Vice, he started connecting with some of the few remaining above board organizations which had shorn any overt trappings of National Socialism. Things like groups like the Christian Veterans Political Council was called. Through them, he published a few pamphlets. One was called "When Will Bolshevism Take Over?" One was called "Germania Delenda Est." He formed his own publishing house when those sold pretty well, called Le Blanc Publishing. Obviously, Blanc is French for white, and Weiss is white in German, so thus the metaphor. And here's what's significant: this publishing and this writing that he did, it got the interest of Der Weg. Okay, what was Der Weg? Der Weg was this magazine, and it was a serious intellectual journal, and it also covered cultural stuff. It was published in Argentina. The patron of it was this very rich German expat, but the editor-in-chief was Johann von Leers, this Schutzstaffel anthropologist and linguist who later converted to Islam and became known as Omar Amin. And he served in the court of Nasser and also found his way to Syria. But at that time, Johann von Leers was enjoying the patronage of Juan Perón. And Hans Rudel, the most decorated hero of the Wehrmacht of the Luftwaffe, he was a Stuka pilot, and he had something like 350 tank kills. And he'd received the Knight's Cross in gold with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. The only man so decorated. Rudel wrote for Der Weg. Adolf Eichmann, almost certainly under a pseudonym, was involved in Der Weg. At its peak, it had something like a circulation of something like 26,000. So this was the voice of the National Socialist diaspora. Okay, Weiss's stuff started appearing in there. And he became largely the American representative of Der Weg. And if you wanted to make contact with the National Socialist resistance in exile, and you were in America, you had to go through Weiss. And if you wanted your content or your work product to reach, sympathetic eyes and ears among the resistance, you had to go through him, who would in turn put you in touch with these people in Argentina. Weiss, like Madel, who we'll get into, he saw the writing on the wall, and like Otto Riemer, who also was involved in Der Weg, although at that time Riemer was in the Bundesrepublik, mobilizing the Socialist Reich Party. But Weiss was a neutralist from the outset on the Cold War, and by the 50s he'd become pro-Soviet for the same reasons Yockey was. And if you don't understand why this is, the reason why is owing to the purges, whether they were intentional, whether there was specific intent to purge Jewish influence, or if that was the de facto result, depends on where you fall on the subject matter and how you interpret the historical record. But it is clear that Jewish influence in the Soviet Union after 1953 was entirely marginal and irrelevant. And the understanding was that, the deep threat to the European culture is the American occupation. The Soviet Union may be brutal, but it's not socially engineering the culture out of existence. In geostrategic terms, the only way Europe can be liberated is through some sort of concord with Russia. And Weiss like Yockey and like Reamer and like Madol, as I'll get into, they viewed communism as having an expiration date. To be somewhat oversimplified about it, they realized that this was very much a form in flux, and the political configuration of the Soviet Union was going to change, and it was changing. So this has nothing to do with fealty to communism. There's nothing to do with Eurasianism, this or whatever people think. People who say those kinds of things aren't familiar with the subject matter. But this was the real National Socialist resistance. It wasn't George Lincoln Rockwell. It wasn't guys who thought the source of all evil was Moscow. It wasn't guys who thought that some secret Zionist council was running the Soviet Union. It was Der Weg. It was Otto Reamer. It was Rudel. It was Johann von Leers. It was Frederick Weiss. It was H.G. Thompson. It was Yockey. And it was Madol. So Weiss made contact with Yockey through H.G. Thompson. H.G. Thompson in turn convinced him to publish Francis Yockey's essay, What's Behind the Hang of Living Jews in Prague. He subsequently convinced von Leers to publish A World in Flames. And finally, von Leers personally reviewed Imperium in Der Weg. And this is really when, the European National Socialists in exile started taking Yockey seriously. But this led to a few different things. And just for context too, because I'm sure it's going to come up in the comments probably. As I said, Der Weg was founded by a group of wealthy German expats, including a guy named Ludwig Frude. Ludwig Frude's son, Rodolfo, he was the private secretary to Juan Perón. And the finances of Der Weg were maintained by the Banco Germanico and Banco Torquist in Argentina. This account was under the name Eva Duarte, which was a pseudonym for Evita Perón. Okay, so it's always been strange to me that they made this movie in the 90s, I think, where Evita Perón is this social justice warrior played by Madonna, and she's having an affair with Che Guevara, and this woman was a National Socialist.
I've never heard of that, Thomas, but to be brutally honest, I cannot think of a movie I want to see less than that. Just every layer of it on top of one another. It's it just seems like the most insufferable film possible.
Oh no, yeah, and I think Antonio Banderas plays Che Guevara. It's awful. But what jumps out about it is there's just a weird illiteracy to it. But yeah, be as it may, I'll get through this foundation. I'll pick up the pace because I realize we got to get to the core subject matter. But but yeah, Imperium getting this stellar review from von Leers was no small thing, and it goes to show you too that the National Socialist diaspora, they were very much looking towards a viable internationalist disposition, cultivating these Latin American regimes, enjoying their patronage, realizing that the resistance had to deal with the Zionist state and had to work towards European liberation. Both of these things concomitantly. But what Weiss did as his profile was raised, he realized he concluded we need some sort of direct action element in America, to protect our people so we're not, running around stealing in the night or running around like scared rabbits. We need physical security, and we need some sort of cadre here. And Vice was familiar with this outfit called the National Renaissance Party. That was the first National Socialist organization in post-war America. It was founded in 1949 from the merger of this guy named Kurt Mertig. He was a Bundist type. He'd founded the German American Republican League, as well as this other above board organization called the Citizens Protective League. They merged with this America First outfit run by a guy named Henry McFarland called the Nationalist Action League that was out of Philadelphia. And that's what formed the core of the National Renaissance Party. Its name is taken from Hitler's final political testament that he dictated to Goebbels. It concludes with, quote, "I die with a happy heart because from the sacrifice there would spring up the seed of a radiant renaissance of the National Socialist movement." Thus, the National Renaissance Party. Mertig himself became the first chairman of the NRP, but he was elderly and in poor health. He turned it over to McFarland. McFarland, in turn, realized that, we can't have this turn into some nostalgia society of old fossils. We need young radicals. Well, McFarland's kind of protege was a then young dude named James Maddow, who'd come up with the Nationalist Action League. And he was too young for the military draft, just coming of age as the war was ending. But he'd spent his teen years fighting in the street, against, American Jewish Committee types, communists, labor leaders. He was known for physical courage, and he was known as a brainy guy. He spent his teens sending science fiction stories out to these various pulp magazines, and this actually becomes relevant to his politics. He was also this expert in Lovecraftian lore. He was obsessed with H.P. Lovecraft and was something of an authority on the Lovecraft Circle and the many kind of, literary efforts that constituted that. Vice, however, was sort of the grand old man, with Maddow kind of being the out front, as this kind of young, somewhat dynamic, action-oriented guy. Maddow wasn't charismatic in traditional sense. He was kind of a nerdy guy, but he was physically tough, and the men respected him, as we'll see. But he was also brainy, and he in kind of a subcultural way, and that worked in his favor with the kind of people he was trying to attract. But Maddow had been an avid reader of Der Weg. He became this big acolyte of Yockey. So when Yockey came back to America in 1954, in no doubt, or in no small measure, because the McCarthy era was underway, and I realized, like, the Enemy and legacy media and court historians, they got this idea of McCarthyism. It was this frightening era of where people were disappeared in the night or something. McCarthy was a flawed guy. He was a limited guy, but he was very sincere. And owing to the reality of the Cold War and the first Berlin crisis, it became clear that we can't keep vilifying the Germans as a people. And it's almost certain that we're going to be at war with the Soviet Union imminently. We need a core of combat veterans to lead this new German army that we expect to die fighting the communists. We've got to let some of these people out of prison. And Joachim Peiper was under a death sentence, and almost all the Liebstandart boys who had been in the defendant's dock at the Malmedy trial were serving prison sentences. Those all got manumitted. Peiper got removed from death row. Peiper wasn't released or paroled until, I think, 1959. But, the culture was totally changing in terms of, its enthusiasm for persecuting National Socialists and vilifying Germany. And Yockey actually wrote a speech for McCarthy. McCarthy didn't deliver it, but it was submitted, which is really interesting. And the subject matter of the speech wasn't Cold War, damn Moscow stuff. The subject matter was about rehabilitating Germany in the public mind. And it was supposed to be given to some political action committee adjacent to this German-American group up in Milwaukee, I believe. But in any event, Yockey knew that that Mantle and the NRP had been promoting his stuff. And he wanted to see how they were progressing and kind of check on their development. And Yockey gave them a bunch of his literature, and he set up a relationship with them whereby the NRP would essentially distribute his work product domestically. Der Weg would do it internationally and kind of reach, the partisan and intellectual core of the National Socialist diaspora. In America, the NRP would distribute, Yockey's screeds and his pamphlets and his articles and copies of Imperium, the full volume, to potential sympathizers and things. And Mandel, a couple years previously, before he became de facto honcho of the NRP, he founded what's called the Animist Party when he was a little more than a teenager. I think he was 19. I'm doing this for context. Has become significant to his worldview and his occultism. Science fiction fanzines then often had a political bent. And there was this one in particular called Starlight Stories. And they'd run some of Mandel's science fiction stories. So he started propagandizing and recruiting for the Animist Party in the pages of Starlight Stories. After Starlight Stories became targeted by anti-fascists and infiltrated by the ADL, among others, he ceased pursuing that strategy. And shortly thereafter, he folded the Animist Party, but that was also concomitant with him, kind of rising in the ranks of the NRP. But this was Mandel's notion was always, he didn't. Yeah, I mean, he viewed fascism and National Socialism as possessing there's a timeless apocal and spiritual truth to these things that was, the only thing that would elevate Aryan man. But the configuration of party politics, he realized that's not coming back as it existed in World War II. And that was one of the things that, constituted his aversion to conservatism. But also, he said, first and foremost, if you're a true fascist or if you're a true, revolutionary or racialist or what have you of the right, you're a futurist and you're looking to elevate the biological and spiritual stock of Aryan man to new horizons. You're not looking backwards, and we revere the past because you've got to look at the racial organism as kind of, being the product of a past, a present, and a future, really simultaneously. And that's why collective memory is so important to historical situatedness, but also cultural identity and the ability to, access one's own heritage, quite literally, and in psychic ways of the higher intellect as well as instinctively. And obviously people who are anti-fascist or people who hate National Socialists, they're fond of saying, well, this is ridiculous stuff. This is just science fiction fanboyism. They're not understanding. And they're not understanding either the role that science fiction played as a subculture in the 20th century. I can point again and again, it's not an accident. It was Jerry Pournelle and a bunch of sci-fi authors who chaired the Committee on the Present Emergency and were responsible for SDI getting funded. Okay, I mean, these guys like Arthur C. Clarke, like guys like Asimov, like Jerry Pournelle, like Robert Heinlein, like Orson Scott Card, they were presenting policy positions in the form of science fiction narratives. Okay, MIT was a repository of science fiction authors. Some professional, some amateur, but there's a reason I write science fiction. Okay, I mean it's got an important heritage in that regard, but it's also a way that you can explore subject matter in a counterfactual way that's actually readable and that presents a conceptual picture to the reader that isn't just abstractly theoretical. But
and this is something that I mean, I'm glad you brought up Heinlein because he's an example people will be familiar with, where science fiction was the way in which the future was sort of discussed and war gamed out, right? It was a way to sort of project present trends into the future. So for instance, right, like, there's any number of these, the three big Heinlein novels are pretty famous for this, but, we did an episode on this forever ago. That book, Future War, right?
There will be war.
It's damn it. This is the worst podcasting ever. Maybe that's what it was. But point is, this was 3 years ago.
Okay.
So my memories of it a little foggy, obviously. But point is, right, it was a way in which you could discuss how events might come to sort of shape human society, coming after the most dramatic change in human organization in history, right? You've got to remember, if you were middle-aged at that time, you grew up in a world of horse-drawn carts and existed in a world of jetliners, right? Like, this was a massive gulf. And so while the change, or the rate of change rather, slowed down, at the time, there was no indication to that fact. And so it sort of was this, well, where the hell do we go next? And so science fiction was not simply sort of a way for, nerds to amuse themselves. It was not simply sort of, one of many cheap entertainment products. It was that, but it was genuine speculative fiction in a time in which everything seemed completely and totally up in the air. But I'll throw it back to you, Thomas.
No, that's well stated. And yeah, and as a subculture too, it attracted political theory guys, it attracted engineers, it attracted physicists, so it tracks. And I mean, don't get me wrong, Mantle was an eccentric guy, and he was fixated with the Atlantis myth as well as Lovecraft, for reasons that were, I mean, a lot of that was largely metaphorical in his discussion of Atlantis, but yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that's one reason why I recommend stuff. I recommend Heinlein and Jerry Pournelle and Arthur C. Clarke to people, and I mean Frank Herbert, obviously, it's important stuff, and it's not as directly relevant to the current strategic situation or something like during the Cold War, but it remains highly relevant. I mean, that's, like I said, that's why I write it. It's not just because there's not other things I could be writing. I believe in it as a genre. But
just a brief interjection, and then we can get back to the main thrust of this. I am not crazy. I did, in fact, do an episode on the 1974 book, The Forever War.
The Forever War,
Joe
right?
Adelman. But looking back on it, I don't think you and I discussed that. I think I discussed that with Morgoth, if I'm not mistaken. So that did occur. Just had some of the details wrong. So I'm not having a stroke, is what I was trying to say.
No, there's this famous compilation called There Will Be War from 1984. And this is obviously peak Cold War, and that was the original version of Ender's Game features in it. There's it's all military science fiction, and particularly stuff relating to strategic nuclear paradigms and metaphors.
Did that feature armor in it, or am I getting that messed up?
No, Armor's one of my favorite books, though, by John Steakley. We'll have to cover that sometime if you're amenable. Yeah, because Armor is incredible. So is Vampires, and Steakley, sadly, he died I think he was only about 39 or 40, I think, but those are only 2 novels, both which are great. But yeah, Armor is some of the best military science fiction ever written. But yeah, to bring it back, and I'm sorry for digressing like that, but one of the reasons Yockey and H. Keith Thompson was a fascinating guy. He was very much an old New York WASP. He was in the publishing and printing business. He was independently wealthy. He and Yockey became close friends, but Thompson was, like I said, I believe he was in the employ of the SD during the war. Throughout the Cold War, he was a National Socialist partisan. I believe he was playing both sides of the aisle. I mean, his sympathy was with Warsaw Pact, albeit for, with qualifications. But Thompson and Yockey, they viewed the NRP as an indicator, however small, that the true right-wing resistance, a true spiritually fascist resistance was making a comeback, thanks to Cold War dynamics and the social engineering intrinsic to that, forced integration and other things. Thompson used some of his wealth and clout to establish the Committee for International Justice in 1952. And that was dedicated to providing appellate defense for, Axis military men who were, serving prison sentences, as well as provide humanitarian aid to their families, prisoners' assistance kind of stuff. I mean, he was really doing God's work. And incident to this, Thompson became the official American representative of the Socialist Reich Party. And he met Otto Reamer. In turn, he became a conduit between the NRP and Reamer and the Socialist Reich Party. So that's another direct connection between the National Renaissance Party and the real National Socialist Resistance. Contra these yahoos and the American Nazi Party and stuff. Okay. That same summer, Thompson made contact with George Sylvester Viereck, who was a big German-American sort of a community leader type, as well as a pretty well-known poet. This voting bloc obviously had a lot of clout in city politics in places like Philly and places like Chicago back then still. So Thompson raised money for the Socialist Reich Party through some of these events and connections through Viereck, and some of those funds in turn made their way into the coffers of the NRP. Okay, so this is kind of how this constellation sort of took hold, and it goes to show you that the NRP was intrinsically credible, in my opinion, based on the confidences that it was able to inspire and the personages who were willing to act as patrons. What's interestingly, that's just to cap off sort of our subtopical discussion of science fiction. There was a guy named Charles B. Hudson, and he was something of a mentor of Maddle. During Maddle's teens, Hudson was one of the leading defendants in the Sedition Act trial that I mentioned earlier. And he was a science fiction author who had a reasonably big following, and he was known through these fanzines and stuff. And he'd been a big America firster. He published a bulletin during the Roosevelt administration before Pearl Harbor called America in Danger. And he worked closely, although I don't think he was an official agent of the Weltdienst. That was the Third Reich press agency for overseas propaganda. It was run by Lieutenant Colonel Ulrich Fleischauer, under the tutelage and supervision of Rosenberg, which is interesting because it wasn't subordinate to the propaganda ministry in Goebbels. But that was another influence on Maddle's early political education, not in terms of science fiction, but also another direct connection to the German Reich in terms of his, ideological lineage. So it's, and Hudson had also been an associate of Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin. They weren't particularly close, but they'd collaborate together. So as Maddle kind of matured in years, he, I think we got a photo of the National Renaissance Party logo. There's a stylized one I sent you and just kind of like a bare bones one. Yeah. Obviously, originally, he was enamored with the Third Reich and things, and he occasionally brand stuff with a swastika, but he later said, no, we're not the National Socialist Party of America. We're our own party, we're our own tendency, and we're not trying to revive National Socialism. But this, so he considered the flash in the circle to be kind of a timeless logo or symbol of, the resistance element, the true right resistance element, distinguished from, conservatism and, typical kind of Cold War nationalism. And obviously too, the black front, that was the Strasserist offshoot of the NSDAP. There's obviously inspiration taken from there, but I think it's a cool logo. But then again, I'm partial to the Pontiac Firebird logo too. So, but yeah, that's Maddle started. You got a proper brand for the NRP, and he said in the bulletin, and I think the early tagline, and it's the first. There was a regular bulletin that endured until Maddle died in '79. It went for decades. What Hitler did in Europe, the National Renaissance Party intends to do in America. And one of the things, again, Maddle, he very much accepted the view of Frederick Weiss and Yockey himself that, in allying with the Soviet Union in the Cold War is essential to European liberation. But also he viewed the Soviet Union as having some admirable characteristics, the Stalinism specifically, because he viewed it as being uniquely situated to resist Jewish power. And obviously it was, it was an obstacle to plutocracy getting a toehold in Central Asia, international finance. It was totally locked out. But, there was a futurist aspect to Sovietism that really endured until the end. And that's one of the reasons their space program is very much centered around this kind of aesthetic and mythos of Russian cosmism. And this very much appealed. There's other early science fiction aficionados who were politically on the right who had a certain admiration for Sovietism, and that's significant too. But more interestingly, at least to me, again, they're vague, which really was the spiritual and ideological strains of which were shot through the NRP. They were very pro-Arab, and they were very pro-Islam as a political quantity, and the burgeoning Islamic consciousness, in those days it was more an Arab consciousness, but the seeds of the Islamic awakening some decades later was definitely being sown too. But the National Renaissance Party, they very much cultivated alliance with Nasser, with Syria, with pro-Islamic nationalists. There was a local guy in New York named John Hassan. He was a white guy, but he converted to Sunni Islam, and he was a member of the Fighting Islamic Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Khifa al-Islamiyya, the Fighting Muslim Brotherhood. And he had a direct action element that calls themselves the Green Shirts, not to be confused with, the Irish guys who deployed to fight for, nationalist forces in Spain. But the NRP and Hassan's Muslim street troopers would click up. They were allied, and they'd fight. They'd fight the Jewish elements together who were, disrupting their meetings. They'd fight communists, in the streets together. They'd meet. There was this Polish-Lithuanian mosque called Masjid Rabbil Alamin in Brooklyn, and there's a portrait of Hassan in his uniform in there for a long time, I guess. And the symbol they wrote under, the Handjar standard, the Bosniak 13th SS, the Bosniak Muslim formation. That's this symbol they utilized was the heraldic standard of 13th SS. And this might not seem revolutionary now, but that was a big deal for a National Socialist outfit collaborating with Arab nationalists or Muslims. And the Egyptian consulate was friendly to the NRP. One of the diplomatic representatives to the UN from the Egyptian consulate addressed NRP meetings a few times, and they had very good offices with Madol, which is fascinating. And it goes to show you too. There's a sophistication here that was lacking, frankly, in most of these types who people consider Madol's peers. We were talking about Rockwell, who I think was something of a buffoon, but even guys like Gerald L.K. Smith, who I think meant well, but they were really kind of cornpone and provincial. But the real kind of occultism of Madol was on full display with his metaphysics. And this was kind of unique to the NRP. Don't get me wrong. I think authors like Nicholas Goodrick Clark, he's the guy who wrote the Occult Roots of Nazism. that became kind of famous because of this goofy, cringe video where like Danzig is like showing off his book collection, and he's like acting like it's some evil book or something. Like it's one of the old, it's one of the old Danzig videos from like 1990 or something. But not music videos, like VHS tapes that they sold, but that kind of stuff's overstated, sometimes wildly overstated, but there was an occult strain to National Socialism. Maddow went above and beyond that, though. He was a big acolyte of Helena Blavatsky, who was this mystic, and she's considered to be sort of one of the founding scholars of theosophy. And this very much played into Maddow's interest in science fiction and Lovecraftian stuff. But his primary, Blavatsky, to be clear, she was some kind of lesser aristocrat. She founded in the 1870s this Theosophical Society, which endured for a long time. This was founded in New York. And she traveled a lot in the Middle East and on the subcontinent. And she, claimed that she'd had spiritual experiences, on the subcontinent at some of these Hindu holy sites where presumably Aryan gods had been channeled through divinating rituals and things, but Maddow's big interest in her body of work was the stuff that she wrote about Atlantis. And that was essential to her theosophical doctrine. She wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine in the 1880s. And she claimed that she'd been granted access in some antechamber, inner sanctum of a Himalayan Buddhist monastery, this book or this ancient text called the Stanzas of Dzan. And she claimed that in metaphorical terms, this kind of described the cyclical epochs of man and man's fall from this sort of godly race of almost super beings to this degenerated, miscegenated race of monsters over time. And that supposedly is the civilizational fate of all races that don't, preserve these ancient and ritualistic magical doctrines that inculcate people with, an understanding of why, the purity of blood is sacrosanct and things. A lot of mumbo jumbo, in my opinion. Like, I've got nothing. I take the esoteric tradition seriously. I mean, that's why I study stuff like Rene Guion and Ivola. But Blavatsky's stuff strikes me as bullshit. But the Atlantean stuff, that's sort of a subculture unto itself, and that's really what interested Maddow, and how much he really believed in what Blavatsky claimed was her source material as being authentic, I don't know. But I believe I think part of this was he wanted to get people interested in the Atlantean myth as a core aspect of, kind of neo-fascist metaphysics. And this is what would be immediately familiar to people who had those interests and identified as National Socialist or National Socialist adjacent. It's hard to say, because when he did come across people like Anton LaVey, he'd make fun of them and dress them down for being what he viewed as, ignorant kind of Hollywood type people who didn't really understand occultism. So it's hard to say. Like a lot of intelligent and eccentric people, there was many emerging contradictions. But you know, the reason why this is important is because Metal wasn't just writing and thinking about Atlantean things as some sort of hobby. In his view, this was directly related to the praxis of an occultic neo-fascism. This was very real. This was something that had to be curated, and there was a political basis to how this was going to be implemented and realized, which I think is quite fascinating. But as I said, he wrote this series of essays that, and by 1974 or so, and again, the NRP endured for a long time. You know, Metal died in 79. And so, yeah, he'd been at it for, you know, over 30 years. But this series that featured very prominently in the NRP newsletter in the 70s, it was titled The New Atlantis, A Blueprint for an Aryan Garden of Eden in North America. And drawing upon kind of the basic outline of Blavatsky's eschatology about the kind of cyclical, you know, Kali Yuga of great races. You know, Metal, he held that essentially the high culture is the progeny of Aryans of great antiquity. And this is spread out through the entire planet. And these culture-bearing conquerors, they were viewed as literal gods, you know, and this endures in native legends, whether you're talking about the subcontinent or Africa or Asia or the steppe. You know, and interestingly, you read stuff, Dumazel, who among serious people has kind of come back into vogue, you know, and population genetics and the mapping therein is, you know, kind of giving credibility to traditional anthropology because it converges, you know. But this symbolic psychological aspect whereby Bronze Age conquerors were viewed as literal gods by the subject populations, and there being this, you know, abjectly racial component to caste. I mean, this stuff is true, you know. You don't need to accept Atlantean mythologies to recognize that. But the, you know, his basic paradigm therein of these ancient racial groups, he adopted the kind of theosophical concept of what's called root races, you know, original culture-bearing elements who in turn shaped this entire planet and all the humanistic aspects of the several cultures of this planet, you know. And he viewed the Aryans as descendants of the Atlanteans, you know, and one reason for their migration was their continent was lost, you know, or their homeland became unlivable in some way, you know, which isn't clear. The NRP view of statecraft, it was based on the ancient Hindu scriptures, law of Manu, you know, a caste system sanctioned on racial lines with a pyramidal kind of social structure ruled over by a Brahmin elite that's a warrior priestly caste that are initiates into metaphysical knowledge and, you know, direct access through psychic and spiritual means to the gods and communion with the gods. But they're also, you know, they have an exclusive monopoly on violence, not just by right and by sovereign order, but, you know, because they're they've been bred to be natural war masters and the overseers of this caste structure, you know. And Metal said that, you know, whether you're talking about pharaonic Egypt or, you know, imperial Rome or the trifunctional structure of Europe that endured throughout the medieval period, This is derived from the Atlantean Aryan law of Manu, and the law of blood, as it were, and blood being the basis of caste and sovereign mandate to rule, and he said National Socialist Germany was approaching this reality, as was fascist Italy. Again, he said the Soviet Union is a totally deformed example of this kind of blood-based law of Manu, but nonetheless, things can be, owing to the structure of it, it can be salvaged if superior dimension material was injected into that extant structure, with the understanding that these people constitute a cadre that views themselves as discrete and insular from the majority, and proceeds according to a racial mandate. And that is basically, with some qualifications, what Yockey viewed as the DDR's role within the Eastern Bloc. But I think we're probably
obviously the context for these ideas are radically different, but it reminds me of what you see in Dagobanu as well.
Yeah,
the kind of like sanguinary nature.
Yep. No, and Metal absolutely read Dagobanu. So some of his, not word for word, but close, of Dagabanu's material pops up in NRP bulletins. Their newsletter was called the NRP Bulletin, but yeah. No, I think this is an important subject matter. It's not just. I think it's significant to the broader topic we've been covering in this series, but I think it's important to anybody who identifies like I do. I mean, to our ideological heritage. If people think, then, like I said, people are kind of willfully ignorant of this stuff, or just kind of slander people like Maddle, saying they had stupid ideas without actually understanding what they were getting at, and what the era they lived in, how that was informing things. And you got to give people a pass in the mid 20th century for not being as sophisticated as they are now. It's just the reality, But yeah, Kerry Bolton's got great respect for Maddle, and he wrote a biography of him. It's short. It's only about 80 pages, called Phoenix Rising. That's one of the things that originally turned me on to Kerry Bolton. Well, I think he's a great theorist. I got huge esteem for him. But yeah, no, thanks for welcoming this particular subject matter.
Oh, not at all, man. Obviously, we will carry on with this series. More to do, more planned. At this point, I assume everyone knows where to find you, right? Our cooperative show, Radio Free Chicago. Last episode, obviously dealing with the unfortunate assassination of Charlie Kirk. I think it's a good one. It's been getting very good feedback. If you want to check that out, linked in the description, as is your website, your Substack, everything else. As far as my stuff, you know where to find me. The episode's early and ad-free for just a couple bucks on Patreon, Subscribestar, anywhere you want to find it. Again, Thomas, man, thank you so much for coming on. I think this series has been invaluable.
Yeah, thank you, Woody.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Light can't last forever. Good night.